Turn the car around. Right now, my wife whispered. I had never seen Eleanor like that. I didn't ask, I just obeyed. And that decision saved my family. When the truth came out, I never looked at my father the same way again. The plan that day was so simple, it barely seemed worth mentioning. I had been up since 5 in the morning, when Portland was still wrapped in thin fog and the suburban roofs lay silent under the cold air. I stood in the kitchen, brewing a pot of black coffee, the smell of roasted beans spreading through the room. Beside it sat a box of donuts I had picked up from the small shop on my way to work. The clerk, who knew me well, had added 2 extra powdered ones because Mr. Robert always buys them for his daughter. Those small details always settled me. We were supposed to drive from Portland up to Seattle, about 3.5 hours on the road, to make it in time for my mother's 70th birthday. I had pictured the whole thing already. A few stiff hugs, some polite chatter, cold dishes on the table, and stories everyone pretended to care about. It would be ordinary, a little dull, and dull was exactly what I was hoping for. I was driving. I always drove, not because Eleanor couldn't, but because I hated the way she braked hard at the last minute every time she merged onto the freeway. To me, driving was a rhythm. Press the gas, hold steady, glide forward. I had once been a kitchen hand who delivered the supplies from Tacoma back to Portland on rainy days, so long drives were just an old habit. Besides, I got car sick if I wasn't behind the wheel. Eleanor never stopped teasing me about that. My daughter sat in the back seat, oversized headphones covering half her head, watching YouTube and humming along to some new pop songs. She was 12, caught between childhood and adolescence, so the ride was a mix of sulks, giggles, and muttered, "You two are so annoying." I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her twirling a pencil in her fingers like some reluctant magician. Little things like that made me feel this trip was just one of those slices of American normalcy. The silver SUV rolled smoothly along Interstate 5. The radio was playing an old country song, the singer's voice stretching long as if to summon memories of dusty roads. Eleanor sat beside me, holding her coffee, staring absently out the window. The forest on both sides grew dark and dense, green road signs flashing in and out. My shoulders eased. Just a few more hours, I thought. Just these familiar stretches to pass. Everything felt so calm. Then Eleanor touched my arm. Just a light touch, but something in it made my heart stumble. I turned. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her face rigid, her lips pressed tight. And then, in a whisper, Eleanor said, "Turn the car around. Right now." I had never seen Eleanor like that. Not angry, not frightened. It was a certainty so absolute it chilled me. For a second, I thought she was joking, let out a short laugh, but it died when I saw her eyes. Cold, unshakable. Not advice, not a suggestion, a command. "What is it?" I asked, my voice dry. "Turn around, please." There are moments when you don't pause to weigh things, when you don't have time to ask questions. You only fall back on the trust you've built over the years with the one sitting beside you. And I trusted her. My hands turned the wheel, guiding us off the last exit before the straight road toward the checkpoint I had just noticed on the sign. The tires bit into the side road, and the brakes hissed. My daughter jerked up, pulling off her headphones. "Dad, where are we going?" I forced a chuckle. Guess I took the wrong exit, but I knew I hadn't. Something was coming. Eleanor stayed silent, eyes pinned on the rearview mirror. I gripped the wheel tighter. My pulse quickened. My whole body strung taut as if bracing for an unseen blow. The air in the car thickened until I could hear my own breath echoing back. Only when we merged onto a narrow road leading south did Eleanor let out a shaky exhale. I had never seen her like that. Normally, she was the one who kept us steady, the one who soothed me with a joke or a gentle word. But at that moment, she was the one who pulled us all back from something dark I couldn't yet name. I didn't know what we had just escaped, but I knew this. If I had ignored Eleanor and driven straight, my life would have split in two right there. On that other road, I might have lost everything. Trust in that fleeting instant saved us. Later, when the truth surfaced, I finally understood what Eleanor had seen, what she had sensed. And I also understood why. From that moment on, I never looked at my father the same way again. If you are still listening at this point, tell me where you are in America. or anywhere else in the world. I really want to know where the audience of this channel is tuning in from. I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington. If anyone has ever passed through this city, they would remember a place that carried both the industrial edge of the harbor and the small town quiet of tree-lined streets. For me, Tacoma will always be tied to the old pale yellow wooden house of the Miller family on South 35th Street. That house had a front porch, a swing hanging there in the summer, and Christmas lights that stayed up until March before anyone thought to take them down. From the outside, my family always looked warm and complete, but inside it was nothing more than a thin coat of paint covering a very different truth. My father was the kind of man who believed that the worth of a man was shown in the car he drove and the whiskey he poured when guests came over. He worked in real estate, sometimes up, sometimes down. The problem was that even in the leanest times, my father still spent like he was the main character in a glossy lifestyle magazine. My mother believed that every family needed to shine. She flaunted with backyard barbecues, cocktail parties where she wore bright red dresses, and shopping trips that swiped the credit card until the machine almost burned out. I still remember winters when the heating bill went unpaid and we had to wear coats inside the house. Yet in those same winters, my parents still invited friends over, opened bottles of wine, and set a table with food we had bought on credit at the grocery store. That contradiction repeated again and again. There was never enough money for new textbooks for me, but my mother still bought 3 new tablecloths just because they looked good in photos. My younger brother Ethan was born 4 years after me. If I were the faint shadow in my parents' eyes, Ethan was their bright light. He was lively, quick-tongued, able to spin a meaningless story and make the whole table laugh. From the time he was small, Ethan was called the Pride. Whenever guests came, my parents showed him off. The boy could sing, the boy was smart, and the boy had leadership. I stood right there carrying trays of food, listening to the praise for my brother while no one asked what I was doing. I was given the label boring. That was my mother's favorite word. "Robert, you are so boring," she told me when I was only 11, just because I chose to sit with a book instead of playing ball outside. My father called me too serious, as if the fact that I did not tell as many jokes as Ethan was some kind of defect. At dinner, when Ethan cracked a joke and everyone laughed, I just pushed my fork around the plate, and my silence became the reason my parents looked at each other and shrugged, as if I had ruined the mood. The truth was that I was not interested in the way they wanted. I did not know how to make people laugh, and I did not know how to flatter. All I knew was how to work. As a teenager, I took the job washing dishes at an Italian diner downtown. The smell of olive oil, the sharp sting of burnt garlic, and the sound of knives on cutting boards became part of my memory. I liked the rhythm of that work. Later, I chose to study cooking instead of business, the way my father expected. That choice only deepened his belief that I lacked ambition. But I was the one who carried the weight of the family. When my father lost thousands of dollars on a failed land deal, he worked overnight shifts to keep the power on. Me. When Ethan was expelled from community college for skipping too many classes, who got called to meet the dean because my parents were too busy with a party? Me. When my mother could not understand the insurance forms after a small accident, I sat on the phone for hours with the company. Me. People say every family has a responsible child. I was that child. But the cost of carrying a responsibility in a toxic family is that you are never acknowledged. What you do is taken for granted, and when you refuse, you become the selfish one. I remember one moment when I was 16. My parents bought a new cream-colored sofa for the living room while my tuition bill sat unpaid. I asked why they would not cover school first. My father just laughed and said, "You never need to save if you know how to improvise." I stood there listening and knew that for him, appearances would always matter more than foundations. And Ethan sat beside him, chuckling as if my father had said something clever. The years that followed were no better. When I graduated with a culinary degree and took a job at a small hotel kitchen, working 12-hour shifts with my hands smelling of onions and garlic, I shared the news proudly. My mother only replied, "Oh, a chef, as long as you are happy. Ethan is about to travel to Las Vegas for work." The comparisons never stopped. Ethan was praised wherever he went, even though he could not hold a job longer than a year. I was still called boring, even though I supported myself and helped the family whenever they were in trouble. I was not perfect. I sometimes wondered if I really was too dry. Maybe it was my fault that I could not create a lively mood. But with time, I realized I was simply different. I chose discipline and stability. They chose glamour and chance. And in their eyes, that difference was enough to push me to the outside. I helped too many times. When Ethan lost a job, I sent him rent money. When my parents fell behind on payments, I advanced cash so the lights would stay on. But every time I said I could not, the atmosphere shifted. My mother looked at me as if I had betrayed the family. My father said, "You always make things difficult." And Ethan, the golden child, only needed to smirk to make me feel like I was worthless. Looking back, I see that my childhood and youth were a string of efforts to prove that I deserved a place. I carried burdens, paid bills, worked myself raw, yet the only title I ever got was the boring son. I believed that if I was useful enough, I would be loved. But the truth was, in a family that only valued image and shine, the one standing in the kitchen with hands that smelled of grease would never be acknowledged. And the bitterest part was that I grew used to it. I accepted the role of the responsible one as if it were fate. I did not know that this very acceptance would open the door for the greatest betrayal later, a betrayal that nearly cost my own small family everything. About a week before the Seattle trip, I got a call from my mother. The first thing that struck me was not what she said, but how she said it. Sweet, gentle, almost unfamiliar. My mother had never spoken that way before. Normally, she was sharp, with a trace of sarcasm whenever she spoke to me. Things like, "Robert, are you still working at that little restaurant?" Or, "Do not forget my birthday this time. Do not be late as always." But that day, her voice sounded like a pre-recorded insurance commercial, full of warmth and invitation. "Robert, I am really looking forward to it," she said. "It will be wonderful if your whole family can come a little earlier. I will make beef stew, your favorite." I froze. She knew well that my favorite dish was lasagna, not beef stew. But I did not react, just murmured. That call ended quickly without the usual complaints. Only sweet words. To me, that sudden change felt like a song played in the wrong key. But I did not think too much. Maybe age had softened her, I told myself. A few days later, Ethan showed up. He came to my house late in the afternoon, just as I had finished a long shift at the restaurant. I was still wearing my kitchen clothes, smelling of garlic and olive oil. Ethan was the same as always, shirt unbuttoned at the top, heavy cologne, and that easy smile as if nothing in the world could ever bother him. "Big brother, I need a small favor," Ethan said. I knew that line always meant trouble. He pointed to his car, where a large brown carton sat. "My car is full, but you have the SUV with space. Can you take this box up to Seattle for me?" Just some small stuff. I looked at the carton. No label, no address, just a box sealed with sloppy tape. I figured it must be clothes or maybe a birthday gift from my mother. I did not want to argue. I was tired, and I was too used to carrying extra weight for this family. So I nodded, lifted the box into my car. Ethan patted my shoulder, smiling like he had just closed a deal. Eleanor witnessed that. She said nothing at the time, only watched quietly. I remember her eyes not exactly suspicious, but heavy. After Ethan left, she asked, "Do you know what is in there?" "Of course it is some kind of gift," I said firmly, though I was not sure at all. Eleanor did not reply, just nodded, but her eyes stayed tense. I ignored it, thinking my wife was being overly cautious. We had a trip to prepare. I did not want trouble. On the morning we left, my parents stood on the porch waving as we drove off. They were smiling brightly, a kind of relieved smile. I still remember my mother's eyes, as if she had just set down a heavy burden. Ethan stood beside them, hands in his pockets, smiling too. They waved, shouting, "Drive safe," like a perfect family in a television ad. Only Eleanor stayed silent. She stared at them through the window, then turned away. Later she told me that in that moment, she knew something was wrong. That smile was not joy at seeing us, it was relief. We merged into traffic on Interstate 5. My daughter put on her headphones, disappearing into her own world. I turned on the radio, letting old country songs fill the silence. Everything seemed peaceful. I sipped my coffee, thinking the gathering would pass like all the others, a few hours of endurance and then back to Portland. But Eleanor was different. She sat upright, her eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. I saw her hand grip the coffee cup so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Near Olympia, we saw a flashing yellow sign, Federal checkpoint, 2 miles ahead. I glanced at it as just another traffic notice. But not Eleanor. I felt her body tense completely. She turned to me, her voice urgent, whispered, "Turn the car around. Right now." At that moment, I did not know why. I had not seen smoke. I had not seen fire. But I knew my wife never spoke nonsense. In Eleanor's eyes, there was a certainty I could not dismiss. I swerved, taking the last exit before the checkpoint. Our car sped off the highway, down a side road through the trees. My heart pounded, sweat rising on my skin. My daughter sat up, pulled off her headphones, asked, "Where are we going, Dad?" I forced a smile. Just took the wrong turn, nothing to worry about. But the truth was, everything had already changed from that moment. I did not know what was inside that box. I did not know what my parents and Ethan were hiding, but I knew this. If I had not listened to Eleanor, we would have driven straight into a trap. Have you ever been in a moment when your instinct told you to stop or turn back? Leave a comment and share your story so others can read it too. When I turned off the highway, the side road quickly pulled us into a narrow path covered on both sides with pines and underbrush. It was the kind of road only locals or the lost would step onto. I drove a few more miles, my heart pounding like battle drums. Eleanor said nothing. She only looked back sometimes, where my daughter had put her headphones on again, swaying to her music without knowing that just minutes earlier, the whole family had almost fallen into a pit with no way out. I stopped the car at a small clearing by the woods, just wide enough to park the SUV without blocking anyone. The engine cut off, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was broken only by the cicadas and the rustle of pine. I unbuckled my belt and drew a deep breath. Eleanor put her hand on mine, squeezed gently as if to say, "You have to do this." I stepped out. The wind carried the resin of pine and the damp of soil. I walked to the back of the car, my heart beat so loud my ears rang. I opened the trunk. The brown cardboard box lay there, so ordinary it made me shiver. The tape was rough, one corner crushed. Nothing special, but that very ordinariness made my skin crawl. Eleanor stood beside me. No word. Only her eyes urged me. I cut through the tape. The cardboard cracked open with a dry tear that echoed in the woods. I lifted the lid. Inside were no clothes, no birthday gift, nothing harmless. White plastic bags stuffed in haste, tied with rubber bands, thrown in a heap. I froze. 1 second, then two, before my mind caught up with my eyes. Fentanyl. The white death I had only seen on the news, the one that had taken thousands of lives across America. I did not need to touch. I did not need to test. Just looking, I knew. We had been carrying a bomb, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that kills in silence. My throat locked. I stepped back, legs trembling. Eleanor gripped my hand, keeping me from collapsing. "Oh God," I whispered. My voice cracked. "They put this in our car, with our daughter in the back." The words left me like a curse. Eleanor did not cry. She only nodded, her eyes wet but steady. "I knew something was wrong," she murmured. I stared into that box as if staring into my own childhood. For years I had been used. They had asked me to do the paperwork, to pay the bills, to rescue Ethan again and again. I had carried it all as if it were a duty. But this was not asking. This was betrayal to the bone. This was them placing my family into death. Images ran through my head so fast they made me dizzy. Police stopped us, dogs sniffing, us dragged from the car, my daughter screaming, Eleanor panicking, and me handcuffed on the highway. That shame would not only end my humble life as a cook, but it would ruin my child forever. All because my parents and my brother saw me as their shield. I shut the lid, my hands shaking so bad I could not seal the tape. Eleanor bent down, folding it back. "We cannot call the police now," she said softly. "Not here. The girl's in the car. We must stay calm." I nodded, choking. She was right. If we called the police here, we would be kept for hours, maybe overnight. My daughter would face questions no 12-year-old should. And worse, my family, the very ones who set this trap, would push it all onto me. "We will return it to them," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "Put it back where it came from. Let them bear it." I looked at her, and in my wife's eyes I saw not only fear but resolve. She did not need to shout. She did not need anger. One sentence was enough, and I knew it was the only way. We said nothing else. I closed the trunk and got back behind the wheel. Eleanor sat beside me, clutching my hand like an anchor. I started the engine, its sound rising in the silence like another heartbeat. My daughter looked up from her screen, puzzled. "What happened, Dad?" I forced a smile, touched her hair. "Nothing, sweetheart. I just remembered I forgot something at your grandparents'." She believed right away. She put her headphones on and sank into her song. I looked at her, my chest twisting. Less than an hour ago, I had let her sit on a bomb because I thought parents would never harm me. The road back to Seattle felt twice as long. I did not turn on the radio. Eleanor and I sat in silence, each with our thoughts. My phone buzzed many times in my pocket, first my mother, then Ethan. I did not answer. I knew they were anxious. They thought I had fallen into the trap. They thought their plan was perfect. But no, not this time. I drew a deep breath, eyes fixed on the road. In my head, one sentence rang clear, as if whispered in my ear. "This is the last time. You will not let them again." We drove back to Seattle in silence. Every mile felt twice as long. I did not turn on the radio, did not sip my coffee, did not even glance at the rearview mirror. Only Eleanor's hand on mine, like a thin rope keeping me from collapsing. When the car turned into the familiar street where my parents lived, I felt as if I were walking into the last move of a chess game, and I knew well this move was not mine to set. The old house was the same, paint peeling, steps cracked, but the porch light burned day and night, a false signal of safety. I parked at the curb, leaving the engine running. Eleanor looked at me. I nodded. We both stepped out. No words were spoken. I opened the trunk, lifted the heavy cardboard box. My footsteps echoed on the worn brick. The front door, as always, was barely locked, and I knew where the spare key lay, under the fake stone in the flower bed, the trick my father always bragged about to neighbors. I reached down, took the key, and opened the door. Inside, the air was thick with cheap air freshener and old coffee. The living room was cluttered with fake flowers, crowded frames, and useless trinkets my parents bought to prove they had enough. I set the box right in the hall, in the open, not hidden, not covered. One act, sharp and final. Returning to them what they had tried to strap onto my back. Eleanor stood by me silent. I turned the key again, locked the door. We walked back to the car. No curses, no exchange. Only a hollow silence I knew would roar in their heads when they saw the box returned. That same night we drove on to Portland. When the city lights spread out across the horizon, I felt as though I had set down an unexploded bomb and left it to go off inside the very house that had raised me. 3 days passed. I went back to the kitchen at the restaurant, slicing bread, listening to the knife's rhythm against the board. But my mind was restless. I knew my parents would not stay quiet. And on Wednesday afternoon, the knocking came, hard and urgent. Eleanor looked through the peephole first, then turned back. Her eyes said it all. My parents. And Ethan. I opened the door. They stood there as if nothing had happened. My mother, in her old fur coat, lipstick heavy. My father, with hands shoved in pockets, face stiff. Ethan, with his half smile, the same one people once called charming, now only cheap to me. "Robert," my mother spoke, her tone almost sweet. "Why would you do that? We only needed a little help." Ethan cut in. "It was just goods, big brother. We need money. You always take things too seriously." I stood firm, blocking the doorway, not inviting them in. Eleanor was behind me, her hand pressing against my back, the current that held me steady. I looked into each of their eyes and spoke, my voice calm, unnervingly calm. "You risked the lives of my wife and my child." My mother blinked. My father shifted, clearing his throat. Ethan chuckled, but the sound carried no weight. I went on, each word hammering into the wood. "From now on, no more contact, no more visits, and do not expect to see your granddaughter again." My mother opened her mouth, but I raised my hand to stop her. "No more words. I carried your burdens all my life, but this time you went too far. You tried to make me a criminal, to make my daughter a victim. I will not forgive." Silence, their faces twisted, as if they were seeing their own reflection of truth for the first time. I closed the door. The hinge snapped shut with a cold click, the final stroke. The door stood between us, the end drawn. Inside, I leaned back against the wood. Eleanor wrapped her arms around me. My daughter stood on the stairs, looking down, her face puzzled. I forced a smile, lifting my voice to her. "It is over now, sweetheart." But in my chest, I knew this was only the beginning. Those people had never once accepted defeat. That night, when the house was quiet, I sat alone in the kitchen. The lamp cast its yellow circle over the wooden table. In front of me was my recipe notebook. For years, I had found peace in those measures. 3 spoons of flour, 2 eggs, and half a spoon of salt. Ratios are clear, honest. No tricks, no lies. And I realized that was what set me apart from them. I chose clarity. They chose deceit. And that difference had become the unbridgeable line. I closed the notebook softly. A strange feeling rose in me. Not relief, not rage, certainty. I had closed that door and I would never open it again. If you have ever faced your own family and still kept the calm I found, share this story. Someone out there might need that strength right now. What I knew for certain about my parents was that they would never stop. Since I was a child, I had seen them push responsibility onto others, always finding someone to blame, always writing themselves into a script where they were the victims. And this time was no exception. After the confrontation, I thought things would settle down. I blocked their phone numbers, refused to open the door for strangers, and tried to guide my small family back to a normal rhythm. But only a few days later, the kitchen phone rang nonstop. When Eleanor picked up, my mother's voice came through, syrupy sweet in a way that made my skin crawl. "Robert is selfish. You cannot be like him, Eleanor. You have to think of family. We are blood." Eleanor said nothing, only set the phone down, but I saw her hand trembling. The messages poured in. Ethan wrote, "So, you just want to make things difficult. We never meant harm. You always think you are better than us." My mother insisted, "Robert, if you had a heart, you would understand we did this for family. You are the son. You must carry the weight." The same old lines I had heard for decades, repeated again and again. But now I no longer felt guilt, only distance. Things escalated on a Friday afternoon when Eleanor called me in panic. She had just received a call from our daughter's school. "Robert, your parents and Ethan showed up. They tried to take her, saying they were family." I dropped the kitchen knife on the cutting board and bolted out of the restaurant. When I arrived, my daughter was clinging to her teacher, her wide eyes filled with fear. My mother stood there, feigning outrage. We are the grandparents. We have the right to take her. Robert is poisoning her, making her turn against her family." Ethan folded his arms, smirking. I stepped forward, my voice calm but cold as steel. "Leave. Now." My mother opened her mouth to argue, but the principal had already called the police. I gathered my daughter into the car, felt her small hand clutching mine, shaking. In her eyes, I saw clarity. She understood. She knew her grandparents and uncle were no longer people she could trust. That night at dinner, Eleanor sat pale-faced. "Robert, this cannot continue." They crossed the line. I nodded. I knew it was time to do what I should have done years ago. I called Mark, an old friend, a lawyer in Portland. We met in a small cafe, the scent of espresso rising above the tension. After listening, Mark sighed. "Robert, this is no longer a family matter. This is a safety issue. You need to file a restraining order immediately." A week later, I sat in the lawyer's office with Eleanor. A stack of papers lay before me. I read line by line, my father's name, my mother's name, Ethan's name. The terms were clear. No contact, no approaching, no calls, no messages. I picked up the pen and signed. Each stroke of ink felt like a blade cutting the rope that had bound me all my life. Meanwhile, my parents continued playing the victims. They called relatives, claiming I had cruelly abandoned the family. They sent long emails, insisting that if Robert had helped us financially, none of this would have happened. Ethan posted on social media, hinting that I had betrayed blood. But this time I did not explain. I did not argue. I wrote no replies. I made no calls. I did not need to prove myself to anyone. I let my signature speak, the law drawing the final boundary. That night, when I returned home, Eleanor handed me a cup of hot tea. She placed it before me and said softly, "You did the right thing. We are safe now." I looked out the window at the Portland rain falling steadily against the porch. For the first time in my life, I felt I had a true home. Not just brick and wood, but a place no one could violate. In the silence, I understood something. Sometimes revenge is not shouting, not proving yourself right. Silent revenge is cutting the cord, raising the wall of the law, and letting them writhe in the chaos they created. And I chose silence. When all the legal procedures were completed, when the restraining order was signed by the court and delivered into my lawyer's hands, I knew one chapter had closed. But a new one had to begin. Life could not remain trapped in painful memories. One morning as I poured coffee in the kitchen, I told Eleanor, "I want us to leave Portland. Start over. Somewhere our daughter can walk outside without fearing familiar faces." Eleanor nodded, her eyes softening. In that nod, I saw complete agreement. We sold the old house. That house carried too many doorbells I refused to answer, too many strange envelopes, too many unwanted calls. The buyers were a young couple just married, full of hope. I watched them sign the papers, feeling no sadness, only relief. What I left behind was not walls or a roof, but the ghosts of the past. We drove northwest to Cannon Beach, a coastal town Eleanor had mentioned many times. Our daughter sat at the back seat, her face pressed against the window, watching the pine trees stream past, gray clouds racing across the Oregon sky. When we arrived, the waves rolled steadily, the salt air filled our lungs, and I knew we had chosen right. We bought a small wooden house on a hill with a porch facing the sea. Each morning I woke to the sound of waves mixed with the cries of gulls. No more ringing phones, no more heavy messages. Only sea winds lift the curtains, scattering light across the wooden floor. I built a small kitchen workshop beside the house and opened a handmade pizza place for travelers. It was not a chain restaurant, no neon signs flashing, just a wooden shack with a brick oven, the smell of dough and oregano drifting out to the coastal road. I kneaded the dough, sliced tomatoes, and made fresh cheese with my own hands. Tourists stopped, sometimes drawn only by the aroma. They ordered a hot slice, sat on the steps facing the sea, and smiled their thanks. I felt content. No one knew I had once been used, once carried the shame of my family. Here I was only Robert Miller, a middle-aged cook living quietly by the ocean. Eleanor opened a small yoga class in town, a bright room with green mats, windows facing the shore. Local women came. Travelers seeking calm came too. They stretched, breathed, and laughed with Eleanor. I saw a real smile on her face, the kind I had not seen in years, while she lived near my parents. Our daughter started at her new school. On the first day, she clutched Eleanor's hand in fear. But within weeks, she had friends. She brought home drawings of the sea, told stories of class picnics. Once I asked her, "How do you feel here?" She answered with a tight hug and simple words, "I feel safe, Dad." Tears nearly filled my eyes. Some evenings, the three of us sat on the porch, the oven still holding the scent of bread, Eleanor pouring tea, our daughter giggling with stories from class. Before us stretched the long shore, waves folding into the sand. The moonlight broke on the water like scattered silver shards. I realized I had found freedom, not the kind to boast of, but the true kind, quiet and steady. Each time I stood before the oven, I remembered the old life. I remember being called boring by my parents. Remember when they planted drugs in my car while my daughter sat in the back seat. Those memories remained, but they held no power, because I had stepped out of them. I rebuilt life with new bricks, with the smell of fresh bread, with the peace of the sea. Sometimes Eleanor reminded me, "Do you remember the night I whispered in the car?" I nodded. That whisper had not only saved us from disaster, but it had pulled our little family out of darkness. The symbols of this new life were the wooden house by the shore, the rhythm of the waves, and the oven always burning. Each time a guest bit into pizza and smiled, I knew I had been reborn. And I also understood something deeper. The most beautiful revenge is not to make others suffer, but to show them they no longer have power over you. I no longer depended on them, no longer carried hatred. I lived another life, freer, calmer. They could call, they could try to explain, but their words fell into emptiness. As for me, I had the sea, I had my family, I had my little home. If someone asked me, what does silent revenge mean? I would point to the ocean and say, it feels like this. An endless expanse carrying away every noise behind, leaving only the eternal rhythm of the waves, steady and proud. If you love this journey of rebirth, subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next elegant revenge story. The news came on a Saturday morning while I was opening the oven for the first batch of pizzas for travelers passing through Cannon Beach. Eleanor walked into the kitchen, holding the local paper in one hand and her phone flashing with breaking news in the other. She said nothing at first, just set the paper down on the flour-dusted table where I had been sprinkling white powder over the dough. My eyes caught the bold headline across the front page. 3 family members in Seattle were arrested in a federal fentanyl ring. The name Ethan Miller stood at the top, and beneath it were portraits of my parents, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen them. The article said the federal investigation had lasted months, and this time they were not so lucky. The drugs seized were more than enough to prove the charges, and the court had sentenced each of them to at least 5 years in prison. I put the wooden spoon down and wiped my hands on my apron. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. I did not laugh, did not tremble, did not even feel that familiar rush of anger anymore. What I felt was a strange emptiness, a lightness as though a room long locked had finally had its windows thrown open and the ocean wind rushed inside. Eleanor looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I only shook my head and said softly, "This outcome was never in my hands. I do not need to gloat, and I do not need to grieve. It is over." That evening, as the waves crashed hard offshore and my daughter slept soundly in the attic, Eleanor and I sat on the porch with steaming cups of tea. I spoke in an even tone, as if telling a story long gone. People can take away money, reputation, and even precious memories. But there are 2 things they can never touch: our truth and our freedom. Eleanor held my hand, squeezing lightly, her eyes bright with trust. I thought back over the road behind me. If that day I had not believed Eleanor, if I had not turned the car back in time, I too might have ended up in that news story, my name splashed across the paper, my daughter dragged into a spiral of crime. That single moment of trust had saved our family. It reminded me that survival does not always come from strength, but sometimes from trust and instinct. Many who hear my story ask, did you ever want revenge? Did you wish to see them suffer? My answer is always no, because I have come to understand that true revenge is not found in loud gestures, not in shouting, not in parading the pain. Silent revenge means leaving, decisively, and letting truth and law do the rest. I was not the one who condemned them. Their own choices had become their sentence. I no longer carry the images of my parents from those lavish parties or glossy family portraits. The last image I hold of them is when they stood at my door, demanding I join their reckless schemes. I shut the doors then, and this time the world shut its doors on them too. Now, standing before the sea at Cannon Beach, I see clearer than ever what silence means. The ocean never needs to prove its strength. It only rolls its waves, carrying away all the noise, leaving smooth sand and open sky. I have learned to live like the sea, without answering every accusation, without arguing every meaningless word. Just living, just moving forward, letting truth shine on its own. My daughter now grows up in a world free of deception's shadows. She can laugh with friends, paint seascapes, lie on the sand with a book without fearing someone might appear to drag her into filth. That is the greatest reward I have after everything. And I know perhaps one day in your life, you too will stand at a crossroads as I once did. One path will be to close your eyes and let yourself be dragged into another's mud. The other will be to turn back, firmly and silently, choosing truth and freedom. No one can choose for you, but I hope when that moment comes, you will remember that silence carries power. This story is not to reopen pain, but to show that there is another road, another escape. You do not need to scream to be heard. Sometimes, simply walking away and leaving it all behind is the most beautiful form of revenge. I closed the journal I had been keeping since the day we moved to Cannon Beach. On the final page, I wrote just one line. Eleanor saved us, but it was the truth that kept us alive. The next morning, I opened the oven again, rolled dough, sprinkled cheese, and greeted new guests. The sea still beat against the shore, the wind still swept across our wooden porch, and my life carried on, calmer than it had ever been. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to follow the channel so we can share more stories about the power of silence and truth. There are moments in life when we feel cornered, believing there are only two choices: to stay silent and endure, or to explode and lose ourselves. But my story proves there is another way. To walk away with resolve, to remain silent, and to let the truth speak on its own. My family chose betrayal, chose shortcuts paved with money and lies. They thought I would forever be the older brother, the obedient son, carrying their burdens, yielding so they could keep living in their illusions. But this time I did not save anyone. I chose to save my own small family. I chose to turn back. Perhaps you too have faced such a moment, when relatives, friends, and even colleagues tried to drag you into their wrong decisions. They called you selfish if you refused. They called you a coward when you stayed silent. But remember, calmness and firm boundaries are sometimes the truest form of courage. Elegant revenge is not an eye for an eye. It does not require knives or shouting. It is the steady gaze, the door closing, the footsteps walking away without turning back. Because the guilty will stumble on their own, and you, by simply continuing to live with strength and kindness, have already won. Today, I have a small house by the sea, an oven, and a quiet family life. It is not the kind of wealth everyone desires, but it is freedom. And freedom is the one thing that can never be taken away. If you are hearing this story, I want you to remember one thing. Listen to your instincts, draw your boundaries, and never hand over your life to pity or to another's control. You have the right to choose silence, and your silence is never a weakness. It carries weight, it echoes, and sometimes it is the final verdict. That is elegant revenge. Not loud, not bitter, just truth and freedom.